Well, good afternoon. It's great to be with you again, and welcome to this MIT Community Forum to discuss the work of Task Force 2021 and beyond. The central task of this task force is to develop, through broad community engagement and thorough analysis, a blueprint for a better and stronger MIT beyond the COVID era. It is indeed about MIT beyond. Today, we will hear from those guiding this effort, including President Reif, who envisioned the value and necessity of this task force back in April and who gave it its charge in May. And after some opening presentations, we will hear from you. The success of the MIT Beyond Task Force relies heavily on community engagement in the process. And this will be your very first chance. Gladly, there will be many others. To participate today, we ask you to submit questions for our panel via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And after the presentations, we'll get to as many of your questions and comments as we can. To be clear, this discussion is not about the more immediate impacts of COVID-19 on the Institute, or about the plans for the coming academic year. The focus of this group and this discussion today is the long-term future for MIT once we're beyond COVID. So without further ado, let's begin this journey to beyond. And to get us started, I gladly pass the floor to MIT President Rafael Reif.
Thank you, Alfred. Let me start by offering special thanks to those leading the task force, to co-chairs Rick Danheiser and Sanjay Sarma, to the workstream co-chairs, a very impressive group, and to the more than 150 task force members who agreed to join in this work. And to everyone watching and to all our panelists, thank you so much for joining us. We're living through a major transition in our society. We're transitioning from a society that tolerated income inequality and racial injustice to one that will be much less tolerant to inequities. We're also transitioning from a society in which many had to commute to an office to work or fly to attend meetings, to one in which people may be encouraged to work from home and attend meetings far away via Zoom-like platforms. Those societal changes will change higher education too, in ways that we cannot yet predict. And that is why we established the 2021 and Beyond Task Force. The collective goal is to use our imagination to envision the future of higher education and to use our minds and hands to create it. In other words, the goal of the 2021 and Beyond is not to wait for the future to happen to us, but to create a future that we want for us. In that work, there is role for everyone at MIT. The observations, the questions, the issues you raise today will help inspire and guide the task force members as they try to imagine and figure out how to create such a future. I look forward to learning from all of you as we embark on this inspiring and possibly historic work. And for that, I thank you. Alfred, back to you.
I thank you, Rafael. So now I'd like to turn to those who are guiding the work of the task force. And there are several work streams that we'll be hearing about briefly at the top of this discussion today before we get to your questions. So in a moment, we'll hear a brief description of the academic work stream by co-chairs Anantha Chandrasekaran and Melissa Nobles. We will then hear about the administrative work stream from co-chairs Joe Higgins and Kristen Van Vliet. We'll then turn to an overview of the third work stream on finance and data from Glenn Ellison and Danielle Corey. And then for the fourth work stream on community and culture, we'll hear from co-chairs John Dozier and Tim Jameson. Finally, and not least, we will hear about student involvement by Yu-Jing Chen, who is Vice President of the Undergraduate Association and a member of the Student Advisory Group to the task force. So all that's coming up, but first, Let's get an overview of the task force from its co-chairs, Rick Danheiser and Sanjay Sarma. Over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Alfred. It's a really interesting time and a time of transition, as Rafael just said. And if you go to the next slide, Rod, this task force, which refers to 2021, as Alfred said, this is not the current crisis, but the future of MIT post-crisis, beyond the crisis. And what we're seeing is a series of changes that are impacting the world, everything from an economic downturn to global trade shifts, the recognition of long-standing racial injustice in this country. If you look at various industries, they're in strife. The retail industry is in bad shape. Commercial real estate is in a state of flux. As Rafael said, a number of us are working from home. Education has been really incredibly impacted. 1.6 billion students, this is a UNESCO number, separated from their educational institutions. And all these world impacts also impact us. It impacts our finances. Clearly, diversity, equity, and inclusion are in front and center for us. The global economy impacts the financial health of our students, future jobs, research directions. International relations are also in a state of flux. And of course, our commercial real estate, how people work, whether they work from home, whether they hotel, what is the next stage of the digital transformation, the future of education and student life. These are all questions that we will examine in this task force. So to describe the task force now, I hand off to my colleague, Rick Danheiser. Next slide.
Thank you, Sanjay, and good afternoon, everyone. So what is the charge of the task force? It's to gather input from across the entire MIT community, and then to develop a blueprint for a new MIT better equipped to fulfill our fundamental mission in the landscape of the new normal of the post-COVID world. I'll remind you that the MIT mission is to advance knowledge and educate students in science, technology, and other areas of scholarship so as to best serve the world and humankind. Well, in executing this charge, we will first consider what we value most in the MIT experience, and then consider the impact wrought by the coronavirus on multiple aspects of the MIT experience, including the institute finances, how we operate in physical space, and so on. Always keeping in mind the importance of community, diversity, and equity, and inclusion in everything we do. On the next slide, we outline the organization of the task force, which, as Alfred mentioned, engages the work of over 150 members of the MIT community, faculty, students, and staff. We have organized the task force into 4 work streams: academic, administrative, finance and data, community and culture, each led by co-chairs. And in most cases, these are further divided into groups, which have in each case 1 or 2 co-leads. What we're going to be doing next is briefly turning things over to the work stream co-chairs and letting them briefly tell you a little bit about the work of their particular work stream. First, though, on the next slide, I want to mention the work of the coordinating committee. We are meeting at least bi-weekly. It is co-chaired by myself and Professor Sarma, and comprises the co-chairs of all the work streams, along with, if you look at the bottom row middle, Mark DiVincenzo, the Vice President and General Counsel, who leads a resource team. This is the Legal and Ethics resource team. And also Steve Bratt, Executive Director of MIT News, who leads the Communications resource team. And I also should mention the important work supporting all of these efforts by Glenn Camiso and Lisa Schwally, who are the staff to the task force. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Anantha Chandrakasan and Melissa Nobles. They are the co-chairs of the academic work stream.
Thank you very much, Rick. It is my pleasure to co-chair this academic work stream with Melissa Nobles. Melissa and I are looking forward to working closely with Sanjay, Rick, our workstream group leads, and all members of the committee. Next slide, please. The academic workstream will focus on exciting opportunities in education, research, the student journey, academic learning and residential spaces, and exploring our outreach beyond MIT. The groups are just getting underway, and their specific focus themes are being defined and developed. As we all know, COVID-19 has already changed the way we teach, deeply accelerating the practice and adoption of effective online and hybrid teaching methods. This disruption has prompted us to think creatively and understand how education can be effectively delivered. We are excited about the curricular opportunities that reach across schools to expand discussions on the social and ethical aspects of technology, which were central themes in the creation of the College of Computing. The research group will consider not only cross-school college opportunities, but also framing collaborations across a national and international setting. There are many problems such as climate that will need broader collaboration networks. The role of fundamental versus practical research will be reviewed, as well as trends in various funding approaches, including government, industry, and philanthropy. We also would like to emphasize mentoring and career development for postdocs and research scientists. This is also a time to reflect on the student journey and explore ideas that will leverage our learning on hybrid education models. One thread will focus on aspects such as advising, mentoring, and community building. The group will also focus on effective career exploration and extracurricular aspects. One important theme is exploring the different opportunities for undergraduates and graduate students. The issues of education, research, and community are tightly coupled to efforts in reimagining the academic learning and residential spaces. There is particular need for spaces that will emphasize hybrid learning and community building aspects of the educational experience. Finally, one of our groups will focus on the many forms of non-degree granting education. This will greatly leverage our current programs, but there is also an opportunity to expand our footprint and explore further. I would like to now turn it over to Melissa.
And now to describe the foci of the 5 working groups, and I'll quickly describe our expectations about how these groups would carry out their tasks. Across these 5 groups, we expect that there will be extensive collaboration as many issues are linked. For example, education and research are intertwined with how we think about space. We also expect collaboration with groups in other work streams. And further, we expect that there will be benchmarking with other universities, both here in the US and abroad. Second, given our current moment and our multicultural future, both as an institution and as a society, Anantha and I are particularly excited about how we can better integrate diversity and inclusion more effectively across our academic work. And then finally, we are really both of us are quite eager to receive community input for our work stream, right? So we are anxious to hear from faculty, students, staff, and alumni. I'll now pass it on to Kristen and Joe.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Next slide, please. So Joe Higgins and I are leading a really dynamic group of people who are interested in thinking about how to make MIT run better on the administrative side. But that means many different things to many different people. So the way that we've organized ourselves around the charge laid out is to have 3 teams that are thinking about where, how, and who does the work of MIT, the mission of MIT. That could be related to the academic mission that Anantha and Melissa just discussed, and it can also be related to various other operational missions, whether it's research, running the institute, creating great cultural experiences for our students and staff and faculty. So we've divided this up into Team Where, focused on campus operations and co-led by Julie Newman and Brent Ryan. Julie is the Vice President of MIT's Office of Sustainability, and Brent has, excuse me, Brent has deep experience in urban planning. So that team that have spun up together really benefits from their experience and perspective of how to make the campus sustainably operate. Team How is focused on the administrative processes under the hood, so to speak, and that's co-led by Heather Williams and Maria Yang. Heather with deep experience in administrative processes in our schools and currently in the School of Science in the Dean's Office, and Maria, an expert on designing much more than toys as a professor in mechanical engineering. And then finally, the team on the far right, Who. This is focused on the workforce operations. How do we think about how to retain and recruit talent and make it a meaningful work experience as part of our life for all of us? And that team is co-led by Ramona Allen, who's also the VP of Human Resources at MIT, and Tom Koken, who has many years of dedicated experience in thinking about the future of work and the future of the workforce. But everyone who has signed up for this to work with Joe and myself on the aspects of this are incredibly excited. We've been meeting quite often to exchange ideas, figure out the landscape of what is working well and must work much better at MIT in the future, learning from our peers and thinking about how to really move the needle together. So we'll take it to the next slide, please. So in summary, what we're working on is how to make MIT work better, whether we're talking about the where we do our work, the how we do our work, or who does that work. These teams have colors and shapes associated with them. So if you are interested in giving us feedback on the where of MIT, where is our space, where is our stuff, how do we think about the physical safety and security of the campus, and how do we make sure we're doing that in a sustainable way by design, then please send your input and participate in that Team Where on campus operations. If, however, you feel like there's things that you would love to see work better about how we do our work, how we make decisions, how we pass data back and forth, how we track how we spend our funding, then this is a great team for you to provide your input to. And then finally, if you're much concerned about who does the work of MIT, whether it's an MIT appointee or employee or a contracted service provider, how are we making sure that we retain and recruit the best and we reward them for the work that they're doing in all of the ways they interact as part of the MIT community? Then please give us your input for Team Who. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joe, who will convey our enthusiasm and very strong interest in your input. Joe?
Sure, thanks, Kristen. So I certainly share Kristen's enthusiasm as well as all the workstream members that we got to meet thus far in the process. It's just terrific to already see the beginnings of their work and everyone thinking differently and thinking deeply about our campus spaces, our people and our partnerships, and our many administrative workflows. So with that, I'd like to turn it now over to the co-chairs of the finance and data work streams, Glenn and Danielle.
So next slide, please. So hi, I'm Glenn Ellison from the economics department, and I'm happy to be co-head with Danielle Khoury of the finance and data work stream. We've got a great team working for us. Lisa and Ken are leading one group. Lydia Snover's leading another group. And our group is a bit different from the other groups in that we're a bit of a cross-cutting group. So actually, can I get the next slide, please? One thing that our group is doing is we're just going to be working with the other groups. I think that, there are a lot of brilliant people on the other groups. They're coming up with many, many different ideas for what MIT is going to do. Task Force 2021, it's not about saving money. It's not about spending money. It's about what are the great ideas to let MIT fulfill its mission. But if you're thinking about those ideas, you do want to think about how much are those ideas going to cost or how much are those ideas going to save MIT. And one of our roles is going to be to work with the other groups when they have ideas to think about what would be the financial impact of those ideas on MIT. The other part of our group, and the part for which I think feedback from the community is going to be much more helpful to us, is we're also supposed to think about MIT's financial practices as a topic. And we're doing this for a few different reasons. One is you want to think about the really big picture idea, parts of MIT's budget, the tuition and the fundraising and the investment management, which have a big impact on MIT's operations. And then we also are really willing to get further down into the weeds and think about all the particular financial practices MIT has. How do you allocate overhead to various activities? What do you do with under recovery? How do you charge tuition to undergraduates and to graduate students and to post-generals graduate students? How do you do your annual budgeting processes? Why are we doing this? Part of this is, related to what Kristen's group is doing on administrative processes. If there are things we're doing that make anybody's life miserable or take up a lot of their time unnecessarily, we would like to make MIT a more efficient place. But I think, actually, we think a much bigger point than that is that financial practices have real impacts, and rules you have for how overhead is charged to various activities are going to affect the research that gets done or that doesn't get done on MIT's campus. Rules you have about how you do accounting for graduate students are going to affect how many graduate students you have, what kinds of things graduate students can and cannot do, what freedom departments have to expand their programs to change things in various ways. And so particularly, I think what we would like feedback from the community for are, if there are financial practices at MIT that have struck you as things that are inefficient, there would be a different way to do it. If you change this practice, I would actually change my real activities, not just my financial activities. We would love to hear about feedback of that kind. And I think the best way for you to provide that is, the task force has an idea bank, and please, any suggestions that you have, we're going to be conducting other forums, but we would like to hear from various people about how the financial practices of MIT affect their jobs on a day-to-day basis and how they think, what big impacts could be hidden in side effects of financial practices that MIT has. Thank you. So I think, I guess at this point, we're on to John and Tim to talk about the community work stream.
That's great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be co-chairing this amazing team that you see here on the slide for the Community and Culture Workstream members. My other co-chair is John Dozier, our ICEO, who joined us roughly 4 months ago. And our partnership thus far has been just tremendous, at least from my perspective. And we hope to continue that work with this team with respect to community and culture looking forward to 2021 and beyond. The primary theme of this team is one you've heard throughout these presentations already, namely diversity, equity, inclusion, and community. And as you'll see on our next slide, please, that in fact is what the work stream will focus on. These 4 pillars, if you will, as well as values at MIT. And I've said this on many occasions, and I'll say it again, which is that to us, diversity, equity, and inclusion are not just goals, but they are also a core strategy. And that's something else that you've heard throughout all the other presentations thus far. And I think that's a very important part of our task force contribution, is thinking about how we will implement these themes in a strategic fashion and also tactically throughout the work of the task force. As you'll see on the bottom of the slide here, there are 4 key questions that we'll plan to address, which are reflective of our goals. One of them is, how will we ensure that MIT's culture is not impacted negatively? And more positively, perhaps, how will we ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion will be core strategies, as I've said, as we go forward? Next, how will we ensure that we cultivate a caring community? You've heard this from other presentations as well. And finally, last but not least, how will we coordinate the many committees, offices, groups, and local communities that promote the same mission? As you saw on the previous slide, there is an amazing group of people who are only a fraction of the people who are dedicated to this important work throughout the Institute. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to, I believe, our student advisory group. Thanks very much.
Hi, everybody. My name's Yu Jing, and I'm a 2022 studying 11-6, and I'm part of the student advisory group here on the task force. I'm on the education group under the academic work stream, but you can see here the range of undergraduates and graduate students that are on the task force across the different streams and the different groups that they're part of. And this incredible, amazing group of students was sourced from nominations from the UA, GSC, OME, PKG, and much more. And these student leaders were really brought in for their unique and diverse perspectives. And in the student advisory group, we are really working to push what it means to involve and engage students beyond the 15 of us on the task force, because we know that there's a range of experiences and perspectives and ideas that are missing. And we hope to bring a broad student perspective across all of the groups within the task force, and we would love for all students to use us as a channel for your thoughts and everything. And we hope to plan to do more active student engagement soon, but know that in the meantime, my inbox is open and welcome for any feedback and ideas, as well as I'm sure everybody else on the student advisory group, and we would love more than anything to hear from you. And now I'll turn it back over to Sanjay.
Thank you, Yu Jing. If you go to the next slide. We are doing this right now in the midst of COVID. During COVID, we're re-engineering a bunch of things to deal with the crisis, the social distancing, the fact that some students are here, some students are not, and a number of us are working from home. And before the concrete sets, the idea is to very quickly take advantage of the things that are actually working better, while also thinking about the future. So with all that in mind, this process is a call for some urgency. We are going through a first sprint that will end in the late summer, early fall. And the idea here is to bring out some big ideas. Then we will take a break. And in that break, we will take these ideas to the senior team and get some feedback. Then in the second sprint, as it were, starting in the late fall through early winter, we will fine tune these ideas and chisel away at them and try and make them more precise and also come up with ways to define success. And then after that, these ideas will be synthesized, and many of them, hopefully most of them, will go into an implementation phase. So with that, I hand the mic, so to say, back to Alfred.
Thank you, Sanjay, and thank you all for those terrific and brief presentations. We have still about 30 minutes, which was right on schedule for us for Q&A. And so just to remind you, if you would like to submit a question, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And the questions have been rolling in. And I think I want to start actually coming right back to you, Sanjay, and perhaps to Rick. One of the questions that came in was about the timing of this task force right here during the middle of COVID, when we're working so hard to adjust the Institute to the moment. It struck me as you were just speaking, Sanjay, that you actually may see this, the timing of this workforce in the midst of COVID as an opportunity and not a hazard or a disadvantage. Could you just speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And Rick should comment as well. I mean, look, we're doing a number of things right now. For example, working from home. Rafael referred to it. A number of us are working from home. And do we want to bring everyone back to exactly the same situation as before COVID? If maybe the future involves a little bit more flexible work, or do we want to transition more directly? Other things that are happening, Kristen and Joe are dealing with massive changes to the way our campus works. And many of those changes have actually improved. Do we want to go back to the old normal and then go to the new normal? Do we want to go directly? Some of these things will be, we do have to take a more indirect path, but some of these changes might have an opportunity to grab before, as I said earlier, the concrete sets and go to a new normal, which is better, more pleasant for all of us, healthier, perhaps better for the environment and so on. So Rick, would you like to add to that?
Well, I'll just allude to something you said a few moments ago in talking about the timeline, and that is that this is an opportunity to introduce, when the smoke clears and we start to get coronavirus behind us, an opportunity to implement some of these ideas, because there'll be a new landscape that we're living in post-coronavirus, and the old ways of doing some things will just not be appropriate. And that's part of the aim of the task force, to envision what will be the more ideal and optimal ways of functioning in many different respects in the new world.
I'm going to stick with you both at the high level for the moment. And one of the first questions that came in was, on a spectrum from incremental to blue sky, where will this effort land? Sanjay?
Well, I think some things are pretty blue sky. For example, the shape of the campus, the way we work from home, as I said earlier, the way we handle work hours. There may be some blue sky ideas that come out of the way our students are engaging with the campus right now. I mean, when we are back together, for one thing, let's make it count. Let's make it do more workshops, more hands-on activities, more piano recitals, more, just let's make campus count. But when students are away, maybe doing an internship at or at a museum or at CERN or at a company, maybe they can get a class out of the way. So there are all sorts of, there's a sort of a spectrum of ideas here. And I think it behooves us to look at them all together. And in some ways, the reason we have to do community and the reason the student group here is so interlaced into our whole activity is to make sure that whatever we do is net positive for everyone, as opposed to merely being, a bunch of one-offs that don't add together.
Rick, do you want to add anything there?
I would just add that what we also should keep in mind is that in some cases, what will result from the work of a work stream is not necessarily a fully developed proposal ready to be implemented, but rather the identification of an important area and opportunity for improving MIT, which might require follow-up by further study by an additional working group or committee. So we're not looking for, and that I think makes it even more likely that blue sky types of ideas might be worthwhile to emerge from this work.
Thank you. I'm gonna turn next to Melissa and Anantha, but first I just want to mention, Raphael, please feel free to jump in on any of these questions if you feel you'd like to add something. The floor is yours at any time. But for Anantha and Melissa, so here's the question. MIT has a long record of inventing solutions to its own challenges, and along the way contributing important new concepts to higher ed in general, from UROP to OCW to edX and more. So beyond those kinds of things, what are some of the big new concepts that your work stream will be playing with and that you think MIT could contribute in this moment? This is along the lines of the blue sky question.
Right.
How big could we go?
Sure. Let me start, and Melissa can add here. First of all, I would like to say that, as Sanjay mentioned, we're going to see a spectrum, right? Already in the spring, we had some amazing advances in how we deliver online education, and we're going to continue some of those ideas, build on them to more polished versions of them, and how we do sort of hybrid education more effectively. But looking across our groups, there's some really amazing ideas coming about. For example, we've always talked about students being able to take a term away, right? So maybe with the advances we've made in online education, that's going to become much more practical and easier. We're also excited about this idea of working across different departments and across different schools and the college. But in the areas of research, also working with other universities more effectively. So I think there are a lot of ideas that are emerging. Melissa, you'd like to add to this?
Sure. So as Anantha said, the idea of working collaboratively across schools makes a lot of sense. And I also think there's certain ways in which it may not necessarily be blue sky, but I think we can think about how we use our campus to advance our goals. So in other words, community building, things that we haven't always paid as much attention to, but which our students and faculty and staff have made it clear that building community is important and our space has to reflect it. So as Sanjay said, although we may be working differently depending on how COVID has changed the workspace, there is still a way in which being together matters, and it seems to matter even more now. And our space has to kind of reflect that. So it may not necessarily be blue sky, but it is important. And I think that's, and I also think that's what we're going to be seeing, some very interesting MIT ways of addressing building community, both real and virtual.
Thank you both. I'm gonna come back to you both with another question, but first, just to let everyone know, we have almost 1,000 people participating and viewing and taking part today. So thank you all for joining us. So here's another question, Anantha and Melissa. The size of the undergraduate student body has often been limited by housing and the restrictions of available classrooms. Can you envision a future in which we have more students learning online at one point or another during their MIT tenure, and therefore the capacity for us to grow our class sizes? Is that something that this task force will be looking at?
We absolutely should explore that idea further, Alfred. And as I mentioned, there's this idea that we had a proto version of called X-terms, where students can, undergraduates can take a term off, but they could still be taking courses online towards their degree. But we did this in a very, very small scale. Again, with all the learnings that we've had in the spring on how we had to just accelerate this online education, could we be much more ambitious? And that's one way. I know that Chancellor Cindy Barnhart has been exploring that more, but that's one of the ideas that we could think about expanding our undergraduate footprint.
Melissa, anything to add?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Anantha summed it up pretty well. Thank you.
Great. Super. Here's a question I'm gonna turn to Tim and John Dozier. So you all are in the midst of launching a process to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion at MIT, and that process will be unfolding on a timeline not too dissimilar to this one. And I know you'll be saying more to the community about that in the next couple of weeks. But the question coming in is, as we look at DEI on a separate process, a strategy, engagement process, how will the inputs from that process, how will the emerging themes shape the work of the MIT Beyond Task Force? So John and Tim.
Sure, Alfred, thank you very much for the question. I'll tell you that the way that Tim and I have kind of imagined the work that we will be endeavoring is really integrating these approaches. Of course, the strategic planning process will lay a foundation, a groundwork for our DEI efforts as we move forward. And DEI is certainly centered in our work stream, but as Melissa also iterated or intimated, we're also thinking about community very broadly to include DEI, but how can we take the attributes of the community that we've inherited post-COVID or with our COVID response? How can we take these attributes and make them live in our work beyond the COVID environment? And obviously, Raphael mentioned online work. How does that take form as we move forward? But getting back to the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, we also recognize that this environment has also has created some very different effects on our communities. And so we want to acknowledge that and also make sure that all the things that we're thinking about, all the things that we're doing are viewed and or responded to through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not only in the context of the community and culture work stream, but so that it's also integrated throughout the other work streams as you've heard from their responses. Do you want to add anything, Tim?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, John. I think you captured it really well. I would just add that as the question was, how will that planning process influence the work of this work stream? That's certainly one part of it. The other is in the other direction. This will be a strong synergy. That is, the work of this group, I think, will also inform the work of the strategic planning process. Thanks for the question.
Thank you both. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to be said about the work that you're doing, how it feeds into this process and its own merits. Here's a question coming to Joe and Kristen. Here's how the question was initially framed, and then there's an add-on question. The initial framing was, can you share more about the early vision and ideas for prioritizing sustainability practices and climate change considerations as we think about the campus of the future. But another take on that same question looks more like this. MIT has been working on campus sustainability for some time, perhaps years. Do you think this crisis will accelerate those efforts or slow them? So there's two different takes on the same kind of question. Kristen, Joe?
Thanks, Alfred. So I think we can answer the second question first. It will definitely accelerate our commitment to a sustainable campus and climate. While there's challenges to doing that, I think if you look at how we've responded so far and even how we staffed up this task force, the idea is that you can't think about the campus of the future without also thinking about MIT's climate action plan, about the challenges we have before us to think about new technologies and new practices, new procurement. And you've seen the team and the folks on this substream already step up to initiate events that are going on in the pandemic response. So that thinking will certainly carry into how we think about the campus of the future. It's more than just having LEED Gold or LEED Platinum buildings, but MIT has that. It's more than just having our own campus utilities plant, but MIT has that. It's really thinking about the way we have that be part of the values that are integral to every decision that we make about a building renovation, about a new building, about the materials we use to build that building. So that is part of our current practice. We don't communicate it as well or make everybody feel that they're part of the solution. And Julie Newman's leadership in her early years at MIT, only here for 5 years, has been quite dramatic. I think that she and Joe will carry that ball forward in the coming plans in a quite dramatic way. So Joe, you may want to also add here.
Sure, I would say that even in all the early discussions that the workstream has had, sustainability has been right at the forefront. I mean, we think about the spaces where the work happens, and in some cases it's not on campus today for a lot of activities, and that's closely linked to transportation choices that we make. So it's, where's the workforce, where are the spaces, and how do we start to think about our spaces in a new way to adapt to the new future? And I think that's what is going to be a lot of collaboration across the work streams to solve that sustainability priority. And that clearly it is in the forefront of everyone's mind in the earliest discussions we've been having.
And there was just a question that popped in, Joe, very much along those lines about, you just said, where the workforce is. And a lot of the workforce right now is at home. And so how do you think of staff and where they're working in the work of your stream?
So we don't come with any preconceived notions, Alfred, but what we are talking about, and just to be clear, this work stream includes thinking about the campus, so that the buildings that MIT owns, the buildings that MIT leases in Cambridge that we all know well, but also our off-campus properties you may be less familiar with. You may have never been there, but that's part of our assets of where we can do our work. And Lincoln Laboratories as well. So we're really thinking about the campus in quotes. In fact, that's even in the slide. So the campus is really an elastic concept. It is where we do the work of MIT.
Love that. All right, Yujing, I'm coming your way. How do you think we can engage students during this time where obviously a large number of students, the vast majority of students, are away from campus? How are you thinking about the best ways to really get input and engagement from all our students?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And that's honestly a question that keeps recurring and keeps coming on throughout MIT's history, how to best engage students. I really think that true community engagement and student engagement is very active, and it is using the structures that exist already. So the organizations, student groups, things that students already buy into and trust, and using those. And also the offices that exist to support students, like the OME or the OMP and everything, and really engaging those entities, because these are the institutions that students trust and students turn to, and really engaging students to have those conversations that we're having in this task force among themselves, because students really, MIT students have the best ideas and everything and are incredibly creative and innovative. And honestly, a lot of the conversations I'm having in my education group, I want to have with a bunch of more students, and we'll be thinking through in the student advisory board about how to best do that. So if any students have any ideas of how they would like to be engaged as well, please let us know as well.
Thank you, Yujing. I know how involved you and other members of the Undergraduate Association are, so thank you for everything you're doing and all the ideas you're giving us about being much better at how we engage the student body. Thinking about students, I'm going to come back to Anantha and Melissa for a minute. The question is, should we rethink the 4 consecutive years at college model altogether? What do you say?
Well, I think, Melissa, you want to start on this one?
There's probably a lot of support for that. I think it should be on the table. I expect that the groups will be thinking about that. As Anantha earlier mentioned, there is the notion of the X terms. I can say as someone who's in the Dean of SHAS, we long have seen the value of students getting away from campus and doing different kinds of things. Of course, we have Misty, which allows students to go away for the summer, but we can imagine that students may want to have another kind of experience, which is precisely why we call that a particular work group student journey. And journey in that way is meant to convey a notion of travel. And one can travel lots of different places. One can have a journey, obviously, on campus, but one can have one digitally, or one can move around. So I think we want to think expansively about what that means, and it will likely mean rethinking the 4-year college model. Anantha?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what Melissa said. This absolutely should be on the table. And I think that there are many different models. We talked about X-terms as just one example, but a tight, perhaps tighter connection with industry opportunities, maybe students working in hospitals or international experiences. But let's also not forget about the PhD and graduate students who also would have similar kinds of experiences where they might spend time away from MIT. And I think that we should consider all these options.
Thank you both. So I'm really pleased to see that a question came in for Glenn and Danielle, because I was worried we weren't going to get anything on finance and data. But there is a question here, and it's a very straightforward one. Where are the resources for all these ideas going to come from? And how will you evaluate the financial feasibility or efficacy of the various proposals?
Take it.
Go ahead, Danielle.
Yeah, so it's actually probably the best question when it comes to finance, right? So the first question is, how much does anything cost? But in reality, that shouldn't be the full thing that is driving our decision. It is more, if this is what we want to do, then it's not so much about how much it costs, but how do we fund it? And so that is actually going to be a lot of the work in our work group. We're looking at the funding streams, the funding models, and how do we set up funding once we have the ideas and we know we want to fund something? How do we set up long-term strategies to fund them over time as well, and not just as one-off? So that is absolutely something that we're looking at. We're looking at all kinds of things. We're looking at philanthropy, investments, the way that we endow money, all those types of things.
Glenn, anything to add?
No, just other than, and sometimes that's Raphael's job to figure out which ones we do or not. And it's our job to sort of say, if you want to do this, here's what it would cost. Here's how we think you could get the money to do it. And then it's that I think that's where our task force ends. And then someone higher up than us has to decide which ones do we do and which ones do we not do.
So I'm just going to do a quick add-on to this one as a question that came in earlier. It could be for Danielle and Glenn, or Joe and Kristen, having to do with being more efficient with our resources overall, with our operations. Is this an opportunity to reduce duplicated efforts, it says? In other words, are we thinking really about the efficiency overall of our operations as we go through this process?
I can start with this. There's many possible answers to this, but certainly that's central to what we're thinking about in our team how, right? Because there's built-in efficiencies, there's silos that have been created at MIT over time that slow us down and don't necessarily lead to a better outcome or a better decision. Some of them are built into the systems we've created to communicate with each other. Some of them are just built into our habits. So there is a strong focus on what would move the needle the most to make MIT more efficient, not to cost less money, but to be more impactful. If that's also less costly or saves time, those are other measures of efficiency, but really to deliver on impact and not get caught up in, well, it's always been this way, so I guess that's how we have to do it. This is a nice opportunity for us to reset that thinking.
Thanks very much, Kristen. We have a few minutes left. I would say 5 or 6 minutes as a few remaining questions I want to get to. And I'm going to take this one back to Sanjay and Rick. And it's really about, again, the engagement process and how critical it is to touch different parts of the community. The question came in about how postdocs are often a little bit on the side of these conversations. And how are you envisioning engaging postdocs more centrally as we think about MIT Beyond?
Maybe I'll just take a stab at it and say that there are, I think the research scientists and postdocs are a very fundamental part of MIT's fabric, and they've played an increasingly important role in research. One of the things we decided here was that this task force would look at certain issues, but not be sort of arrogant about saying that we can solve all the issues. Postdocs, we do have some postdocs on the task force. We want as much input as we can get. But as Rick said earlier, I think that deserves a sort of a follow-up group to look at that entirely. But I do think that highly trained postdocs, especially in this moment of COVID, when MIT is so deeply involved in research related to COVID, everything from technology, engineering to biology, postdocs are a very central part of it, but I do think it deserves its own separate activity with some representation in this task force.
And I'll add, if I may, that in addition to having some postdocs actually in some of the key groups, which I think postdocs would be most concerned with, each of the groups is certainly involved in gathering input from other members of the community besides the ones represented.
You're muted, Rick. Okay. So I'm gonna stick with the two of you for a moment, if I can. The question is, it's great that the task force is encouraging so much input and engagement from the community, but how will you sort through all of the ideas that come in? How will you prioritize the brilliance that will come your way?
I think that we will have, I hope they'll be overwhelmed. That's a good problem to have. My feeling is that, and already seeing the input from some of the committees, from the groups, you can see the big ideas take shape. We do plan to actually, we've already had dozens of messages. I get maybe 10 emails, links to where the websites, we send them out. We have not been overwhelmed yet. Please overwhelm us, because that's when we know that we're getting all the input we possibly take.
Rick and Sanjay, I was also struck by the photographs in the slide deck. You have an enormous group of work streams and committees and subgroups. How many people are involved in the actual work at this time?
It's on the order of 150 actual members currently. And as we've mentioned, that includes people from the faculty, from members of the staff, students obviously, and postdocs as well. And through the Idea Bank and other vehicles, we're collecting and eager to get input from every other member of the community. So we hope that there will be engagement with everyone who has any ideas.
So Melissa and Anantha, one last one for you. And it is, about this question of engagement. We often think of the student journey with a focus on undergraduate students. Do you have any early thoughts about the future of MIT for graduate students and how you'll think about the graduate student component as we do this work?
No, actually, I'd like to answer both the graduate students and postdocs. We absolutely have to consider our undergraduates, but graduate students, postdocs, research scientists. And I think one of the key things is also sort of the whole mentoring and career guidance that I think needs to be integrated more deeply with the different groups. As we said, with graduate students, there's a lot of exciting opportunities. Opportunities within MIT, but for them to also collaborate. So we might have graduate students doing more collaboration with industry, for example, How do we facilitate that? We have more and more students and postdocs working with hospitals. How do we get them access to data sets from hospitals and so on? So we have to, our education, research, student journey, all these different groups have to think about both undergraduate and graduate students, but also deeply about the postdocs and research scientists and other members of our research community.
Yeah.
Melissa, anything to add?
Well, just to say that when we say student journey, doesn't only mean undergraduates, it also includes graduate students.
Here's a question for the whole panel, and this is just as we wrap up, and then I'm going to go to Raphael for a question, and then back to Sanjay and Rick for final words. But the question of the whole panel, and I love this question, here it is, directly, citing directly from the question. All of us are dealing with a world that feels upside down, and it can really be hard at times. By contrast, all of you seem to be energized by thinking about the future in an unrestricted way. You actually seem to be having fun. So, how are you doing that? Anyone want to answer that one?
Well, it's easier to think about the future than the present, isn't it? But I do think that because we're all, I think everyone in the gallery here is getting an X-ray view of MIT right now, and this X-ray, it's like getting an MRI of a patient, right? And we have lots of ideas of things that we might have put off before this crisis, that we know to be dealing with now, that we know we could deal with even better if we thought about it. And that's what energizes us, I think, about this task force.
Anyone else want to add anything?
I would agree with that. I think, you know, it is encouraging to think about the future. There's many parts of the present that are not hard. We're in many meetings and Zooms where we're not this smiley, right? But the time is frozen behind me of, you know, the spring. But while all of that is still going on and the operations and the recovery on campus are still going on, if we're given this opportunity to figure out how to make MIT that much better, why not take advantage of that? So that is a great release for that part of our brain. I think that's why we look so happy right now.
Raphael, I'm coming now to you, and this was your idea to point us in this direction in this difficult time. The question is, you've given a huge assignment to Rick and Sanjay and the rest of the team we see before us and all the other faces we saw. What is it about this group and the process that they've organized that gives you confidence that we will, in fact, be able to imagine MIT's future for 2021 and beyond?
Well, number one, if they don't do a good job, there is nothing I can do, right? I cannot take their tenure away. But more seriously, look, we have done it before. I mean, at least on 2 occasions that I can think of right now in the last 15 years or so, when we had a very major crisis that was institute-wide, we assembled the collective wisdom of the place to try to find solutions for it. So we have done it before and it has worked extremely well. I honestly believe that in a situation like the one we're facing right now, and just about with any problem, but this particular one, I really believe that we are all limited by our imagination, by what we can think of. And I think if we gather the collective wisdom of the place to think, just think of it for a moment. We have at MIT, we're blessed with some of the most talented people in the world with the best intentions to do something to make a positive impact for society. Rick earlier mentioned the mission statement about advancing knowledge and educating students for the benefit of humankind. I mean, that's a tremendous mission statement. So you put up people who think that way, who are talented, but thinking with the best intention what they can do for the world, for society, for humanity, for MIT. You put them together and you ask them to use their imagination and their collective wisdom to come up with a solution for this pretty challenging issue to try to invent the future. I am completely convinced that they will come up. If there is a way to think about it, and there is a way to build that future, this group and this community is the one that will lead the way.
Thank you, Raphael. Sanjay, Rick, back to you for closing thoughts.
Thank you very much. If we can put up the final slide, I just want to say that, first of all, thank you to my incredible colleagues, to the students who are on this gallery, to Raphael for commissioning us. I particularly also want to say that we have some incredible staff working with staffing the committees, and we nominated them. And these are people who we think have both incredible talent, but also great opportunity to contribute. Just wanted to, as we close, say that first of all, keep in mind that you can submit your ideas at this website. It's the TF 2021 MIT EDU/IdeaBank website. There's also more information on that website. I hope it's become abundantly clear that this is not about the current crisis. The current crisis, if you want to learn more about, then you can, there's an email there you can reach out to. But all these colleagues are also involved in dealing with the current crisis. And I particularly also want to thank Rick Danheiser, who's been a wise and witty partner in this, wise, witty, and thoughtful, I should say, because he's in the midst as well of rethinking, they just announced the grading policies, et cetera, et cetera. So everyone here is zoomed out most of the time, but everyone is stepping up to think about the future of MIT. I really appreciate that. And I get goosebumps when I see some of the ideas come out. So thank you, everyone.
I add my thanks. We are just at 4 o'clock and we are wrapping up on schedule. And I think that's a great harbinger for the work of this task force. Thank you all for joining us. There were some questions we did not get to. There will be much more to come from this task force. It will be communicating and sharing as the work unfolds, much more to learn and hear and ways for you to participate. So thank you all for joining this initial opportunity to contribute and to ask questions. We thank you and have a great afternoon.